Hello, my name is James. Oh, this camera. Hello, my name is James Bridges, and I am one of two lead bakers at Haymarket by Ashbourne Farms in Louisville, Kentucky. We are a farm-to-table grocery store that is owned by Ashbourne Farms, a large estate farm just outside of Louisville, with about 7,000 acres total. Most of that wildlife conservation, but it has been a working farm since 1937 and has been kept in the Brown family since then. Today, we are going to start with a focaccia, rosmarino, which is a rosemary focaccia, using Caputo 00 flour, the blue bag pizzeria, and using a poulish, which is a yeasted pre-ferment, similar to sourdough starter, but without the added lactic acid bacteria. All right, first we are going to add the water to the mixer. Always add the water first. And then we are going to add the poulish. I've got it in a bowl, which makes it a little bit easier for getting it all out. And finally, we're going to add the flour. Now, I haven't actually added all the water that we're going to use initially. And I'm doing that because I'm using a technique called Bassinage, which is a French technique for adding water later after we develop the gluten. The reason for doing this is because it's easier to develop gluten at lower hydration. And because this is a higher hydration dough, it's going to be close to 75%. We want to get that gluten developed first before we add that extra water to it. So the word bassinage literally translates to bathe or to drench. And so we've held back 15% of the water that we're using. And then once we get that gluten well developed, we're going to add that at the end of mix, and it's going to absorb it all with no problem. Okay. And then we're just going to start that mix on low speed, speed 1 on the spiral, just to begin to get that flour fully hydrated. Once that flour is fully hydrated, I'm going to turn it up to speed 3. And for the first mix, we're going to do just about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we're going to give it a rest. This style of mixing is known as an improved mix, and it kind of sits halfway between a straight mix and an autolyse. And an autolyse is where you hydrate the flour in just water for a period of time before you add the pre-ferment and the salt to it. But it results in mixer downtime. And so the improved mix is a style of mixing that was developed that kind of addresses that, results in less mixer downtime, but you get the added benefit of hydrating that flour ahead of time. What that does is it begins to make those gluten bonds. As soon as those gluten proteins are mixed with water, then they begin forming. But it also begins the enzymatic activity. So you have alpha amylase and protease enzymes, which kind of get to work breaking down those polysaccharides into fermentable sugars, and also conditioning the dough by breaking some of those longer gluten chains into shorter, more easier to manage lengths. So now I'm going to turn it up to speed 3. And I'm just going to allow that to continue to mix until all of the flour in the mixer is totally hydrated. We don't want any dry spots, because if those form now, then we'll never get them out of the dough and you'll end up with lumps in your dough at the end of it. Once it is fully hydrated, we are just going to leave it to rest for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll complete that mix. Another advantage to doing this is it shortens the overall mix time. And by shortening that overall mix time, we are going to reduce the amount of oxidation. Oxidation to the flour destroys the carotenoid pigments, which results in an almost graying of the flour. It goes from a yellowish hue to a gray hue, but it also affects the flavor, the texture, and the keeping qualities of the resulting bread. So less oxidation equals better tasting, better textured, and longer lasting bread. So we want all three of those things, so we're gonna let it rest for a few minutes before we do that second mix. So I'm just going to scrape down the bowl a little bit here. We've got a little bit of flour that's stuck to the sides, and we want to make sure that all of that gets incorporated. I try to be as precise as possible with my baking, but I also try to be a bit loose in the sense that, you know, every batch of dough that I make is a little bit different from the next. So, you know, I'm in California today, which is an environment that I'm not used to. Maybe the humidity is lower than the humidity in Kentucky, where I'm used to baking. It's possible that although I'm using the same flour, that this batch of it has a little bit lower moisture or a little bit higher moisture. So all of this is to say that you know, read the dough and pay attention to what the dough is telling you. And if you need to use a little bit more water or a little bit less water, or mix it a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, then make those adjustments. And the more you do it, the more it'll just kind of become second nature, and the dough itself will tell you exactly what it needs. Today, this dough is telling me that it needs just a little bit more water. So I'm going to grab just a little bit of that, and we're going to add it to the outside of the bowl, just to make sure that we incorporate all the flour into it. So I'm just adding a little bit more water to this mix, just to make sure that I fully hydrate all of the flour. And remember, we did hold back some of the water from the original mix, so we are going to possibly reduce the amount of water that we add late, but we may end up adding just a little bit more depending on how well that gluten develops. I'm just going to take, I've got a little bit of the dough that's climbing the breaker bar there, so just kind of cleaning that up. And we'll give that about another 30 seconds. We're going to rest this for about 15 to 20 minutes before we continue the mix. All right, this is looking well hydrated now, and we're ready to do that rest. So I'm going to stop this mixer and we'll come back to you in about 15 minutes time. Okay, we are back after about a 15-minute rest on this dough. So I'm going to finish this mix off. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the salt to it. We do a delayed salt addition because adding salt actually tightens the gluten structure, and initially we want to keep that dough nice and loose, but by adding the salt at the second stage of the mix, it's going to help us to develop that strength. I'm going to turn this up to about a speed 7, which is medium-high. Now you'll notice that I haven't added the olive oil to it yet, That's because olive oil actually coats the gluten, and it interrupts the formation of that gluten network. Any fat that you're adding to the dough can also be called shortening. And the reason it's called shortening is because it actually shortens that gluten structure. And we want to keep a larger, more open crumb structure to this. So we're allowing the gluten to begin to develop first, and then we're going to add the oil to soften it and to relax it a little bit more without shortening that gluten structure too much. So we're just going to give it another minute or so. And as I'm looking down into the bowl, I can see that the dough is fully spread, and it's sort of taking up most of the bowl. As that gluten develops a little bit more, it's going to start to tighten up. It does something which I call a pumpkin, where it starts to look like a pumpkin in the mixer. And it's generally going to start to climb that hook and breaker bar a little bit, and start to pull away from the sides. While I'm doing that, I'm just going to check the temperature of the dough. And we're pretty warm today in here. It's about 78 degrees Fahrenheit. And as long as I get this mix done under 80 degrees Fahrenheit or so, then I feel pretty comfortable about that. It's a little bit warmer than I like to be. I like to come out around 75 or 76 degrees Fahrenheit. That will have some effect on the dough rheology itself, which is dough is a viscoelastic, which means that it exhibits properties of both a solid and a liquid. And the warmer a dough is, the more it behaves like a liquid. And the cooler a dough is, the more it behaves like a solid. And so by having that slightly warmer dough temperature, it's going to be a little bit softer, a little bit more liquidy. If it gets too warm too fast, then you actually won't be able to develop the gluten. So that's another advantage to adding the water late to it, because we've got a much lower hydration. We're able to develop that gluten more, even though the dough is a little bit warmer today. And now I'm going to add the olive oil to it. The smell of that olive oil coming off of it, oh my God, so aromatic. Now there's a test that you can do called a window pane test to check the strength of the gluten as you're developing it. And I'm just going to need to get a little bit of water on my fingers for this so that it doesn't stick to the dough. And this test involves taking the dough and stretching it between your fingers, and you want it to pull translucent without tearing. And you can see that this dough is tearing, and so it's not strong enough yet. So we're going to carry on developing it. The more that you mix the same dough over and over again, the more you start to really hone in on various cues to let you know when your mix is done. For me, some of those are visual cues, what it looks like in the mixer. Some of those are auditory cues, where the sound that it's making starts to tell me when it's ready. And those cues can be different depending on the type of mixer that you're using. So for instance, if you're using a spiral mixer, there's a sound of, you know when you pop bubble wrap, how you get that little crack pop sound? The more that it mixes, you'll start to hear those little popping, and it's air bubbles that are getting introduced into the dough, and as they start to pop, that's because the gluten is tightening around them, and that lets you know that it's really well developed. Pay attention to those little nuances, those differences in the way that the dough looks and the way that it sounds. As we get into bulk fermentation later, the way that it smells is a cue for me as to how close we are to the end of bulk fermentation. So there's lots of little cues that over time I pick up on and you'll pick up on too. So we're starting to look a little bit more developed here. While we're mixing now, you may be wondering, can you overmix? And the answer is yes, absolutely you can overmix. And you'll generally know it when you've overmixed as well, because what is getting progressively stronger will eventually turn to soup in the mixer. It won't have any strength at all. It'll start to tear apart. It will ferment much faster generally, and it ends in tears. So you do have to be careful not to overmix. As to how to tell when you're about to overmix, really for me that comes down to trial and error, and you know, the more that you work with the same dough, you begin to kind of get a feel for about how long you're going to mix it for at about what temperature, and that doesn't change that much. I mean, a little bit here and there, but it's essentially the same thing. Just adding a little bit more water to do another window pane test, and you can see that the dough is definitely stronger than it was. Still not quite there yet though, so we're going to mix that another couple of minutes. So I've been baking sourdough for almost 10 years now, but I've baked more in the last 3 years than I did in the first 7 years combined. So, you know, I would say at about 100 loaves is where you kind of start to begin to have a clue what's going on. And at about 1,000 loaves, it's when it really kind of starts to make sense. I've probably baked about 6,000 loaves this year. So for me, in many regards, it's just kind of autopilot. So let's give it another check here. This dough is looking much stronger now. All right, now I'm just going to add the last of the remaining water. I'm not going to add all of this though, because this mix is on the warmer side and that dough is much softer as a result of it. I don't want to add too much to it, so I'm just going to add a little bit. And then we're just going to wait for that water to get absorbed into the dough. Okay, and this mix is now done, so I just need to grab a container for bulk fermentation and we'll transfer the dough to it. We are finished with our mix and ready to transfer to a container for bulk fermentation. I'm just going to grab a little bit of the olive oil that we used and pop it down into the container just to help with sticking. I'm just going to use my hand to kind of rub that around a little bit. Also is going to make it a little bit less likely to stick to my hand as I'm transferring it out of the mixing bowl. Nice strong dough, very cohesive. And now we are just going to let this bulk ferment at warm temperature for about an hour. I'm going to give it one fold, and then we are going to put it into the fridge to retard the dough, do a bulk retard on it. One of the beautiful things about this dough recipe is that it's really, really versatile. You can make it the day of, you can make it the day before, you can make it 2 days before. The longer you cold ferment it for, the more flavor it's going to develop. But if you're going to cold ferment it for more than a day, then it generally needs to go into the fridge a little bit sooner. There's a relatively high amount of the poolish in here, the pre-ferment. 40% is a baker's percentage. That should give us a lot of flavor development in a shorter amount of time. If you want to extend it out multiple days, then you can reduce the amount of poolish that you put into it in order to lengthen that fermentation time just a little bit. So I'm going to cover this now. I'm going to give it half an hour, put a quick fold on the dough, and then we are going to pop it into the fridge to retard for a few hours. We've waited 30 minutes and it's time to put that first fold on the dough. I'm just going to get a little bit of water on my hands so that the dough doesn't stick, and then I'm going to perform a coil fold, which is a more gentle fold than a stretch and fold. I'm just going to grab the dough from the middle underneath, pull up towards me, and then fold it forward again. And then we're just going to coil it up, stretch it, and turn it 90 degrees. And then we're going to do the same again. Coil, coil. That is it. Another 15 to 20 minutes, we'll pop this in the fridge, and then we'll come back to it later this afternoon. Okay, so we've had the focaccia in the fridge for about 4 or 5 hours doing a bulk retard on it, and now we're going to get it in the pan and start to proof it. I'm just going to add a little bit of olive oil to the pan, and because we are baking a large focaccia, it's 20 by 20, we need about 3 kilos of dough. So I'm just going to check to make sure that I have the right amount of dough here, and I do. Just a hair under, but it's good. We're going to go with that. And then you can see that this dough is nice and strong and elastic here. But because it's been in the fridge for 4 or 5 hours, it's tightened up quite a bit, and we want it to relax and loosen so that it can begin to stretch out over here. So all I'm going to do with it is I'm just going to kind of tease it out just a little bit here, and then pick it up and transfer it over. And for now, that's really all we have to do to it. As that dough relaxes and begins to proof, it will get even more loose, and we'll be able to stretch it out more. And eventually, by the end of proof, we will have filled this entire tray up and we'll be ready to bake it. Another 30 to 45 minutes, we'll check it to see if we can stretch it some more then. Okay, we've let this focaccia dough rest for about 45 minutes after placing it in the pan. So we're going to do the first stretch on it now just to begin to tease it out. I'm just going to get a little bit of water on my hands so that they don't stick to the dough. And then we're just going to gently stretch the dough out. We don't want to tear it. And eventually we want it to fill the entire pan, but we're going to need to do probably at least one more stretch on it after the gluten relaxes out a little bit. So one of the things that can help with the stretching process is to use the weight of the dough itself to allow it to stretch out. So by holding it up, the dough actually pulls down using gravity, and then gently stretching it out. And that's really all we need to do now. We'll let this rest for another 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll do the final stretch out on it. All right, time for the last stretch of the focaccia dough before we do the final proof. Just getting my hands wet once again so that they don't stick to the dough. And then gently stretching the dough out to fill the pan. Now we're going to leave this to do a warm final proof for probably about another hour or so. And then when it's nice and bubbly, we can give it a good dimple and bake it out. Okay, we are back with a fully proofed focaccia that we are ready to go ahead and get dressed for the oven. The first thing that I'm going to grab is a little bit more olive oil. Just give it a nice drizzle across the top. And then I'm going to use my fingers to dimple the dough a little bit. We're looking for the focaccia to be nice and bubbly and airy. And by dimpling it, what we're doing is we're docking it down. That's going to keep it flat. And we're creating lots of nice little caverns that will steam up as it's baking. And then you can top the focaccia with whatever you want. Today we're going for a pretty basic one with some rosemary. And it's end of season and we've got some sort of cherry, plum, tomatoes from the garden here that we're going to use, because if you've got in-season tomatoes, then it makes sense to go ahead and get them in there. So with these tomatoes, I'm just kind of pushing them down a little bit into some of those dimples so that hopefully as the dough rises in the oven, it will kind of envelop the tomatoes. Just kind of chuck them on there. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. Just make it look pleasing to you. And these cherry tomatoes have a lot of moisture in them that's going to still keep them juicy once it's finished its bake. All right, and that looks good, I think. Maybe one more there. And then we're going to give it a sprinkle of fresh rosemary. And finally, we're going to finish with some flaky Maldon sea salt. Just going to add saltiness, but it's also going to add a little bit of crunch and texture to the finished focaccia. All right, now we're going to bake this at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's going to take about a half an hour, but we'll keep checking on it. And we'll see you in about half an hour. Okay, that focaccia has been going for about 30, maybe closer to 35 minutes, and I think that we are ready to go on it. So I'm just going to get my oven gloves on and get it out of the oven. There we go. So I'm just gonna let this cool for just a couple of minutes, and then I'm gonna transfer it out of the baking pan here onto a cooling rack so that that base stays nice and crispy as it's been frying in the oil while the focaccia has been baking. And then after a few more minutes of cooling, we'll cut into a slice and see how we did. Okay, this focaccia is cooled enough to cut into, so I'm just gonna give it a little bit of a scissor here. Get a nice slice for myself. Beautiful, crispy crust on the bottom. Oh, that's so fantastic. Beautiful. Bella.